January 1888. A widow with one stack of hay between her and the open Dakota sky, no husband, no fuel, no neighbor brave enough to be seen at her gate, and a cold coming across the plain that would, before the month was out, put its own name in every family's mouth for the rest of their lives. No one helped her. They watched her tear into her own haystack like an animal and decided she'd lost her mind to grief. They came to that haystack on their knees before February, the whole frozen town, begging to be let inside the thing they'd laughed at. But in early January, it was only a sad woman and a pile of hay. Her name was Pearl Hatcher, 32. Her husband John had gone under the ice on the slough chasing a strayed heifer in December, and the cold finished what the water started. John's father held the deed, and he was a hard, frightened man who decided a childless daughter-in-law was a mouth he wouldn't feed through a Dakota winter. He let her keep the far field with its one big haystack and its caved-in soddy, and he let the neighbors know that the Hatchers would remember anyone who carried so much as a stick of wood out to her. They expected her to walk to the railhead and be gone. Pearl looked at the soddy, which was half fallen and would cost her wood she didn't have to heat, and then she looked at the haystack, and she made a different choice. Because Pearl had grown up on hay, she'd wintered stock on it, slept in lofts of it, dug lambs out of drifts, and warmed them in it, and she knew the thing every farm child knows in their hands and never says out loud. Hay is the warmest poor thing in the world. Not because it makes heat, it doesn't, but because it is full of still, trapped air, and still air is the finest blanket there is. A foot of packed hay will hold heat the way nothing else a poor woman owns can hold it. Folks heaped it against their foundations and over their root crops for exactly that reason. Pearl simply meant to climb inside it. She had a week of bearable weather. She spent it building a house out of a haystack. She tunneled into the south side of the stack, low, and hollowed a chamber in the heart of it, a space just big enough to sit up in and lie down in, with 3 feet of packed hay on every side and above. She lined the walls by hand, pressing and packing until they held their shape, and she shored the roof of her little cave with 2 salvaged rafters from the dead soddy, so the weight above couldn't settle down on her in the night. She floored it with planks over more hay. She hung a horse blanket and John's oilcloth coat across the mouth, one behind the other, a pocket of dead air between them. And here was the danger, the one that made the town's mockery almost fair. Hay and fire are old enemies, and a careless flame in a haystack is a way to burn alive in your own bed. So Pearl did not light a real fire inside it. She built a tiny tin firebox out past the mouth of her tunnel, sheltered under a scrap of roofing, vented to the open air, and she used it only to heat stones. Round field stones, 6 at a time, baked through in the coals. She wrapped each one in sacking and carried it into the heart of the stack, and 6 hot stones in a 3-foot wall of hay would hold the warmth of her body till morning. No flame near the hay. Only stone and trapped air and her own breath. She tested it the first hard night, curled in the dark heart of the stack with her stones, and lay listening to the wind comb the plain outside. The thermometer she'd jammed in a fence post read 11 below. In the hollow of the haystack, banked all around in still air, it sat at 39 and climbed when she breathed. By the time the deep cold came, Pearl Hatcher was sleeping warm inside a pile of grass the whole township had watched her ruin, and the thin smoke from her little stone fire out front was so faint that the town decided she was as good as buried. Then came the 12th of January, and the Dakota plain met the storm it would never stop talking about. It came out of a mild morning with no warning at all, a wall of white that dropped out of the northwest and turned the noon to midnight in the space of a breath. School children were caught on the road home. The temperature fell 40 degrees between dinner and dark and kept falling. 19 below, 28, a black, screaming night, the glass read 40 under zero behind the lee of the store. The wind did not stop for a day and a half. When it finally broke, the plain was littered with what the cold had caught in the open, and there was hardly a family on it that hadn't lost something or someone to that single afternoon. Houses that had stood fine in ordinary winters were boxes of still air with a stove inside. And at 40 below, a box of still air is a coffin with a fire in it. The heat went out through the walls faster than any stove could throw it, and across the township the windows went dark, one after another. And out on the far field, from the south side of a torn-open haystack, a thin breath of smoke rose steady against the killing wind, and a single stack of hay stood there in all that white death, plainly, impossibly, keeping someone alive. The Voss family saw it from their failing soddy on the second day, smoke where the widow's stack should have been silent. The father had nodded along when old Hatcher closed the gate to her. Now he wrapped his children in everything they owned and broke a trail a mile through the drifts toward the one thing still breathing on that plain. Pearl heard them at the oilcloth before she saw them. She pulled it back, felt the storm reach in for her warmth, and said, "In, quick, and pull it shut behind you." And there they crowded, a frozen family in the warm heart of a haystack. 6 stones glowing faint under their sacking, 3 feet of grass between them and the worst night the plains had ever made. Before I tell you who came across the snow last, if you're in the warm dark of that stack with Pearl now, do one small thing for me. Tap subscribe so the next story finds you. Then let me finish it. By the time the storm let go, 11 people had broken trail to Pearl Hatcher's haystack. She took them into the hollow in shifts, warmed them with the heated stones, melted snow over the little outdoor fire so they could drink, and taught every family the thing the whole township had laughed at, that you cannot heat a leaking house, but you can wrap yourself in still air. Bank your walls with hay, with straw, with snow itself. Heat stone, not a room. Get inside the blanket instead of trying to warm the barn. A whole frozen township learning to survive from a woman they'd watched tear apart a haystack. And on the last white morning, old Hatcher himself came across the field, the man who'd closed every gate to her. His big frame house had burned through its woodpile and its fence and gone cold around him. His hands under the wrappings were ruined at the tips. He stood in front of the torn-open haystack he'd let her have as a worthless scrap, the haystack that had outlasted his fine, warm house, and the old hard man could not say a word. Pearl looked at him a long, long moment, long enough for the closed gates and the warning to the neighbors and the whole cold winter of it to come back and stand between them. Then she lifted the oilcloth and said, "Come into the hay. It doesn't ask who you are." He crawled into the warm dark and sat among the people his fear had meant to scatter, kept alive by the haystack he'd sneered at. He didn't apologize. The words weren't in him. But when he crawled back out, he stood a long time in the snow, and then he said the field was hers, and the deed, and that he'd say so in town with his own mouth. And he did, which, from him, was very nearly a miracle. A newspaper man rode the thawed roads out in February and crawled into that haystack with his notebook and wrote the line they'd carry to her grave. The widow who wintered in a haystack while the town froze. The county recognized her claim on the testimony of every family she'd warmed, and Pearl Hatcher kept her land. She farmed it another 30 years, and she built a snug house in time. But every autumn for the rest of her life, she put up one great haystack close to the door, bigger than her stock could ever need, and banked it deep. And the neighbors learned to stop asking why. On the coldest nights, the children swore you could see the widow Hatcher's smoke rising not from her chimney, but from a little fire out by the stack, and they never could be sure which the old woman was sleeping in. "You can't warm a house that leaks," she'd tell them, "but the Lord made hay full of still air, and still air is the warmest poor thing there is. You just have to be willing to climb inside it. If you've ever torn into the one poor thing you had left and made it the warmest place for miles, tell me about it in the comments. And to keep these frontier survival stories coming every week, tap the red subscribe button right below this video.